We have with us Mark-David Hosale, an old friend of mine, and he is a computational artist and composer, and wears other hats too, but those are the things he lists in his bio. He's associate professor and chair of computational arts in the School of the Arts, Media, Performance, and Design at York University in Toronto, Canada. He's given lectures and taught internationally at institutes all over the place, and his solo and collaborative work has been exhibited internationally at lots of different venues. Mark-David's work explores the boundaries between the virtual and the physical world. He says his practice is varied, spanning from performance, music and theater, to public and gallery-based art. His interdisciplinary practice is often built on collaborations with architects, scientists, and other artists. He's the founder of ND Studio Lab, an adaptable space for research creation based on theoretical discourse, methodological development, and the production of works in the areas of art science, computational art, and interactive architecture. His research work emphasizes methodological development and the integration of hardware, software, and digital fabrication with the goal of creating immersive works that blur the divide between the virtual and the real. He's also invested in a parallel theoretical practice that has been focused on a concept called world making. Works that focus on world making challenge the world and how it could be through a kind of future making and or other world making, by creating alternate realities as artworks that are simultaneously ontological propositions. The connecting tissue in his work lies in the interest in knowing. How do we come to know something? How do we know we know? And how do we express what we know to each other? Through immersive art, we are able to create new experiences that saturate perception, expressing concepts that are beyond language and only genuinely knowable through the senses. So that is directly from Professor Hosale's website. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Mark-David Hosale.
Thanks, John. So now I don't have to give my talk. That was everything I was going to say. Anyway, I was also going to say that I was thinking about, because I have a music background, and I was thinking about, at some point I decided that, I don't know if hate's the right word, but performing made me really uncomfortable. Like, it caused me a lot of anxiety. And one of the most stressed I ever was actually John was with me. We played on the radio. And for some reason, like, there was like 2 people in the room, but for some reason my brain could just picture the whole radio audience out there, which was probably the biggest audience I ever played for. So, and anyway, I think I'm okay today, but you know, I was like shaking and playing at the same time. So anyway, this is, I was thinking of that because it's my first time ever live streaming anything. So anyway, I wanted to start off by reading a manifesto. And so this is a manifesto by an artist who I've gotten to know, named Agnes Dennis, and she's an environmental artist and from the 60s, 70s, and she did a lot of work. So what that means, there's these artists who work with nature as part of their art, or like kind of urban scale art. And so like one of the things she did was she planted like a field of wheat in the middle of Manhattan. And this became, you know, because the real estate was so highly valued, some of the most expensive wheat in the world, you know, and that also had something to say about, you know, kind of the toxicity of the soil of Manhattan and all this stuff. So, and she's done things like made things that, you know, we might think of as like generative patterns, like geometrical patterns out of trees and you know, large landscapes, and just a really beautiful and thoughtful work. Anyway, so here's her manifesto from 1970, and oh, maybe I'll as I try and do this stuff, I'll post things in the chat so you can find out more. Okay, working with the paradox. defining the elusive, visualizing the invisible, communicating the incommunicable, not accepting the limitations society has accepted, seeing in new ways, living for a fraction of a second and penetrating light years, using intellect and instinct to achieve intuition, achieving total self-consciousness and self-awareness, being creatively obsessive, questioning, reasoning, analyzing, dissecting, and re-examining, understanding the finitude of human existence and still striving to create beauty and provocative reasoning, finding new concepts, recognizing new patterns, desiring to know the importance or insignificance of existence, seeing reality and still being able to dream, persisting in the eternal search. Yeah, it's a lot of stuff I wanted to say. Actually, what is in my bio? That's probably not surprising, but yeah, I wanted to start off to talk about knowing, and there was some point, I think, in my PhD, probably around the time I was trying to actually write my dissertation, which is when your epiphanies happen, I think, and it's kind of like looking at all this work, and I've done like a bunch of different disparate work up until then and even now, but and I was trying to think, well, what connects this? What is the connective tissue in my work? And so I really thought it had something to do with knowing, like really wanting to see the world in different ways. So I keep coming back to this manifesto, which is kind of like crystallizes so much for me, but seeing in new ways and exploring the paradox of knowing. And so part of that is like, how do we know we know? And, I think Descartes was trying to explore that when he said, I doubt that people always cut the I doubt off, but I doubt, but I think, therefore I am. So it's like doubting the self, like this kind of deep cynicism. So, and then if we know something, how do we express that knowledge to each other? So the way I kind of, the answer I came up with was that we express what we know to each other through stories, and so knowledge is, you could argue, is declarative or rhetorical. And so just like I'm telling you a story now, I'm expressing knowledge through this storytelling. There's a couple of works probably worth looking at in regards to that. So I was just gonna go through my website because I thought this was easier. So there's this project, which this is a project John and I did with each other, and I checked, it's on his website still, so he doesn't mind if I share it. But without going too deep into it, I mean, it's kind of a it's a political piece, but it's not a political piece in the sense that there's a banner on it that says vote Democrat or whatever. It's not telling you to think a certain way. It's more about experience. So, experiences through images and sounds, and makes comparisons between like this kind of like Cold War propaganda that we used to see in newsreels and stuff, and contemporary propaganda. And this was during the time of the Iraq War. So it was very much like responding to that kind of esprit de corps, I guess you could say, and the construction of it was intentionally erratic, I would say. So we developed this kind of a bunch of different, so it's kind of looks like an arcade machine if you think about it, right? And so in it, you could argue there's these like spaces, which we called nodes, and each one of them are a different artistic expression. And so one way we thought about this is a medium, and like potentially as it with any medium, like a screen or billboard or radio, that, you know, the amount of content that you could display on it is infinite. However, it's shaped by the medium itself. So this medium has this affordance of this kind of old computer war machine, and so that automatically is a filter. And then we have these nodes in it, and then depending on how and if you interact with the nodes, it would change the structure of what you would see next. And so I thought of this as a kind of storytelling, but it's a storytelling that is, you know, interactive, nonlinear, and yeah, unpredictable, and you know, so so anyway, so that's kind of like, you know, in some ways one of the roots of this kind of thinking, and then for oh, I'm there already. And then one of my major projects for my dissertation was this work, which is completely different, and you'll see that again over and over again, but called An Uncommon Affair at Tootingbeck Common, which is this interactive film. And what it is it's a story about a real person. It's a biopic, I guess you could say, about this woman named Rosemary Brown, who would talk to the spirits of dead composers and write down their latest music. And the way I constructed the story was I filmed it in such a way that there are 4 parallel storylines that are simultaneously happening. You can think of them almost like parallel universes, where depending, and then you have this interactive interface, and you can decide which story to follow, and the stories are attached to characters. So depending on which story you follow, the protagonist changes. And so if you follow Rosemary Brown, she's genuine, and you know, the ghost is real, which is Franz Liszt, and you know, and she's trying to convince everyone that she's a genuine psychic. And but if you follow the reporter who comes to visit her house and interview her, she's the skeptic. So nothing's real, and everyone's trying to, has, you know, nefarious motives and all this stuff. So depending on who you follow, the story changes. And there's something interesting. I mean, it's very musical, this piece. It's like there's almost no moment without sound, without musical sound. And so I had to compose the music in such a way that no matter where you were, things would kind of work. But it has this feeling, if you're familiar with a bit like Berio's Symphonia, or, you know, where you have these kind of like swirling orchestral sounds, and the in moments, you know, where it gets more quiet, and you know, there are moments of silence, but what I've noticed was when people watch it, the story starts to fall away. And when I asked people what they thought it was about, they would start talking to me about they would see all the interrelationships between the characters. So these are things when you write a script that you write in. I wrote the script to this myself, and I thought that was interesting. It's kind of a side note, but in this kind of chaos, what comes out is this human connection. So anyway, so one thing about, I started thinking about storytelling and this idea of rhetorical declaration of knowledge, and then comparing that to art. And I'm not trying to create, let's say, a debate here, but it's more of a contradistinction, or that in art, what art does is, or one of the things that art can do is it can communicate without rhetoric. And so I got interested in thinking about how art communicates, and I think this like falls into the area of what we might call aesthetics. So you could argue that a definition of aesthetic is a internally consistent language that, or yeah, or expression of an idea that beyond language, I guess. Of course, there's a big connection between aesthetics and conversations about beauty. I probably don't have time to talk about beauty today, but that's another lecture. And this relates to a different kind of knowing, because if you think about it, like rhetoric's very much tied to logos and logic. And so it's about kind of like thinking through the mind. Whereas when you communicate in our other senses, you're actually starting to communicate through the body. And so this kind of knowing is a kind of embodied knowing. And so one of the examples I like to give here is like, I can talk to you all day about Bach and how Bach works. I could explain to you the rudiments of Western music theory and how the scale systems work and everything, but you will not understand Bach until I play you Bach. And the only way to really know Bach is to hear it. And that means that, you know, something is there that is beyond language. And then when we get into the kind of question of art and technology, what technology is doing is in this very kind of McLuhan-esque way, is extending our senses. So it extends, extends our perception into the realms of the imperceivable. So like, for example, if you think about scientific instrumentation, you know, it allows us to either see, you know, the greatest distance that we can see in the universe, which is like billions of light years, or into the like most microscopic, which reaches down into at least evidence of the quantum. Actually seeing the quantum is a little tricky, but and then therefore, you know, when we make art, we talk about this concept of media art, and we make the medium. So this is very much another concept that probably started with Defendix. Then we're making the message itself. And so that might be a definition of media art, but then the idea of the computational is something deeper, because we're actually dealing with the systems behind it that you know, drive this information. So we're getting beyond the level of the tool and down to, you know, making our own tool ourselves to express something that's like much deeper to what we want to say, I guess. So any questions so far? Or?
I'm kind of curious about what you were just talking about there, because it made me think about computer languages and how we use those to actually create experiences. And I wonder if in your mind that computer language, which seems almost the height of logos, right, is something that actually communicates beyond our typical language, or if it's, or how would you view it?
For a computer language?
Yeah, I guess in the context of, you know, since one of the methods we use is simply computer programming, is one of the methods we use.
Well, I think it's the way I would look at it is, well, I guess there's a couple of things I would say about it. So one is, you know, it's well, I can't pretend that I'm doing this. So I just use standard programming languages, but there is this whole domain of esoteric programming languages. So I think you can get away from this kind of, you know, our standard kind of logic. But yeah, part of, I think, the aesthetic of computational art is working in systems. And so that's what programming, for example, affords. But in all art, you run into this kind of like, there's always this line that we balance on, which is between what's quantifiable and what's qualitative. And so we're using, you know, quantifiable systems to create qualitative experiences. So there's this kind of like interesting paradox in there. So in a way, I guess what I'm getting at is you're really working both. You're using the mind and the body, and and that's part of what I find so exciting and enriching about it. And that these systems, well, I was sort of avoiding a conversation about beauty, but these systems also can be used to create natures or new natures. And, so there's this kind of relationship between arguably, I'll talk more about this, but like kind of an ontological, how you view the world ontologically. And then if you can quantify that in some way and make that a system, then it can become something that is expressive that you can experience.
Yeah, there's been a little bit of talk here recently about the difference or the dividing line between system building and then the creation of art and music. And where do we cut off one? Are they the same? How much time should we spend building systems, and how much time should we spend creating experiential things with those systems? So maybe you could shed some light for us.
Well, that is a good question. So I was talking to someone about this recently. So when I first started really learning to code, like I could script and stuff, but to like really code like with object-oriented coding, the first language I really got good at was Super Collider. And then the second language I got good at was PHP, but that's another story. But then Java. But anyway, I think I know like a lot of languages now. But I had to quit Super Collider for a while. I use it still, but and the reason is there was some point where I was like, I'd found some sample code and I started playing with it, and I made this like really amazing noise suppression tool that used magnitude threshold noise suppression. So I was like in the frequency domain, and I was like, I made it, and then I was real proud of myself. And then I was like, well, what the hell am I going to use this for? And then I was like, well, I realized I wasn't making art anymore. I was just making these like cool tools, and I wasn't even sure. Well, I mean, clearly there's a use for that, so I'm not arguing there isn't. But if you have a lot of windy sound recordings or something, but at the same time, I was a bit like, well, this isn't helping me make art. So I just had to put it down. And now when I use Super Collider, I only use it for art. I stopped making, my tool habit went away. But so making tools for their own sake. So there is a balance. I can talk a little bit about that. We can see how far we get. But because I'm not, one of the things people might ask, I don't know if they do, but if they look at, go through my websites and stuff, is why there aren't very many software releases. Like, and it's because I really think in more high-level frameworks, and then I apply those to systems. And so it's those frameworks that I use. But the goal for me is not to get too bogged down in the tool making, and to get to the art making as soon as possible, while still making my own medium and all those things.
I think that's excellent advice.
Yeah. So anyway, I saw a note here. Can we see the interface to Uncommon Affairs? So this is the Ouija board, and you would, if you slid your finger here, you would see the character, and then if you slid your finger here, you would be able to go forwards or backwards in time. And then these are all the different scenes in the movie, and they would get out of sync. And so anyway, all right, it's good to take a little brain break there. All right, so ND Studio Lab. So I am lucky enough to have a lab of my own, and a team of students that work in the lab. And actually our graduate program's pretty new. So it's about, I want to say we're going into our third year of the graduate program. We just started accepting PhDs last year. So, and suddenly my lab's busy. No big surprise, I guess, but I've had my lab for a while, and And if you look, you know, I have current and past lab members and students involved. So you can see I've worked with a lot of people. But anyway, so I tried to kind of boil down my most recent activity into kind of three main areas. So one is this architectonic media interventions. And so part of my weird biography, which I didn't really get into, but my master's is in music theory and composition. And I got that from Urbana-Champaign, Illinois. And so it's pretty traditional study because of that. And then I did my PhD in media arts and technology. And then when I graduated, I started working with architects. And I ended up, and the project I started working with architects with was this one called Quasar, which was with an architect named Jean-Michel Crétaz, who is a professor at the Southern California Institute of Architecture in Los Angeles. And this is the first Quasar that we worked on. I had several main collaborators. And this was at the gallery at SciArc. And this is about 30 by 30 foot installation made of these kind of glowing tubes. And in this installation, there was something called a muon detector in the gallery. And what it did was it detected cosmic rays in real time using Geiger tubes. And when it detected a cosmic ray, there would be an event on the body. So what you can't see in these still images is that the light is moving and it's flowing on the body like water. And so the events were like splashes in the water, and there was sound connected to them. And that wire you just saw, that was a proximity sensor. So it would actually change behavior just by entering the room. So it's a bit inspired by the Heisenberg uncertainty paradox and the idea that you cannot observe something without changing it. And then there's a drawing interface where you could draw on the body of it. So you could draw with cosmic rays, basically. So that's kind of the idea. And I'll talk more about that in a second. Whoops. It's okay. More than one way back. Okay. So then I moved to the Netherlands, and I ended up becoming a professor in a Technical University of Delft, and in architecture. So this was a weird thing. And they knew I wasn't an architect, so I wasn't trying to fool them, but it was in a research team that was interested in interactive architecture. So I did a couple projects there and was involved with a bunch of other things, but this one called the Interactive Wall, which was this piece here. This is Hyperbody, the research group I was involved in. And I don't know if you can hear that. Let me kill the sound actually. So this was, you know, I don't have a lot of videos, so that's why I wanted to show you this. And video is helpful, but this is a wall, you know, of segments that move, and they would bend away from you as they got close to them. We tried it the other way around, but it was actually scary to have a wall bend towards you. So, and you know, the idea is that, you know, it in its like resting state, it kind of has a sinusoidal wave-like motion that moves through it, and then as you walk through, you're disrupting those wave patterns. And you can also play games with it where someone could stand on one side of the wall and another person could stand on the other, and whoever's closer, the wall will bend away from them. So you can kind of like push each other back and forth with the wall. So, and Festo, they make industrial robotics systems for manufacturing and stuff. So that was part of a big fair called the Hanover Messe. And then I worked on this floor with architect named Marco Verde. So this was the lab I ran, which had a 180-degree projection system, 16 loudspeakers, and this interactive floor, and with force-sensitive resistors in the tiles, and it kind of worked like a giant touchpad. And so then I ended up at York, and actually some Quasar comes into play again, because this is the first piece I ever did in Toronto, which was a remount of Quasar in an underground parking garage as part of an event called Nuit Blanche. And so they get about 1 million visitors at Nuit Blanche every year when it's not COVID and they can have it and all that. And so for this particular thing, we're estimating about 80,000 people saw it, which is kind of amazing for at least crowd size, right? And this one wasn't so interactive. We did put some proximity sensors in, but with that many people, it's just like, it basically flatlines the sensor. So it's like, I mean, there are ways to make it interactive. A lot of the events, I should say, at Nuit Blanche, if they have interactive stuff, there's these huge lineups, so if there's like a touch screen and stuff, so we didn't really want that. But anyway, that was a choice. So that's that. And then I did a couple in the architectural domain. I did a couple of solo works. Most recently, so the Homunculus, Agora, which was like right after that, and it was up for a year in a museum. And these kind of pieces that I cast into a bio resin. So it's like a bio-based resin alternative to epoxy resin. So it's biodegradable, and it didn't use fiberglass. It used a material that's also biodegradable. So these won't kill the planet and live forever, it's part of the logic. But, and it's, well, you can read the whole story there. But then then most recently I made this pavilion structure. And all these things have sound, since you're composers, if you're wondering. Sound's extremely important in the work. So they're all audiovisual, but physical. And working with architecture really fed in well with my interest in my work in immersion. So, if I was going to say that what this work represents in my thinking, it's really about immersion. And again, coming back to knowing through the senses, when you're able to immerse someone in art, and I should say, by the way, that probably the most immersive art I can think of is sound. Because, when we have spatial audio, and it's like, it really takes you someplace. You can be anywhere if you think about it. And I'm sure you all know that, but if you have like a really excellent field recording of the beach and you close your eyes, you're there, and it's like, it really doesn't take much, and much harder to achieve in some ways and with other means, or, and when you combine music and image and space and architecture, you can do something really amazing. I might point you to like Zanaki's polytopes, for example, if you want to see some interesting examples there. And so if the concern is about, and again, it's like coming down to aesthetics, but knowing through the senses, and immersion completely saturates the senses, that means you have this potential to really embed someone in an experience that it could be alien from their knowing, and in this sense, I really argue that it's ontological, and that through these experiences you can propose things that that people otherwise might not have known or thought of, and so they become kind of propositions. And propositions for other ways of living, other ways of connecting, other ways of being. And I think connected to that is this concept, which is, I don't know if John mentioned, but I can tell you about it. I guess I should self-promote, but I'm not I always read reluctant, but I'm editor of this book called World Making as Techne, and I think what I'm talking about really relates to this idea of techne, and it's this Greek philosophical term, which essence means it's kind of like the height of making. So techne, you know, it's related to technology, and techne, sorry, I'm kind of stumbling over my words right now, but it's not just what you make, but how you make it. So the thinking is that through techne, that making can be also a process of exploring concepts or putting concepts forth, so that the making of the thing itself is as much part of the work and how it's made as the work itself. And I think that very much relates to computational aesthetics. So like when you talk about like systems, and systems as art, that the system itself makes the art, but it's all like infused. So there's no scaffold, there's nothing hidden. It's all really part of one cohesive thing.
I think that's a really interesting thing you touch on there, especially for some of the people now who are making interactive or even generative music, you know, and sometimes there can be a question about why make generative music if you could just, you know, do it yourself manually. And I think that the answer to that question is maybe in something you just talked about, which is interesting to me. That, you know, a justification for why do things in a way that's meaningful, but maybe invisible in the end result.
And
Could you
yeah.
also talk about, I know these pieces deal with communication amongst various nodes again.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some networking involved, and I'm curious how that plays a role in the thinking of it.
Well, that's another story, but I'm glad to go into that. But I was talking about frameworks, and this is kind of in the book and in my dissertation too, but I'm not necessarily trying to sell you my book, but that's where you'll find out about it. So this is a kind of model I developed, and this is it. I mean, I've totally implemented this in Java, C++, most recently Node.js, in Max. Well, Max needed a little Java to make it all work, but there's this kind of idea of like abstracting. And one of the thinkings is like a way of thinking about how these works are made is to separate data from the medium. So meaning that, you know, like I was mentioning, like Defendex, I mean, we had decided to make this kind of, it looks like a matrix, the node, but it wraps around so you can move, you know, in any direction through that matrix. But we can actually have any structure we want. And so one way to look at it is like let's say you're working with cellular automata, and so that could be your data. And then you could, if you have the system, you could think of it in a way, and this is why I think of it as kind of like the universe, because in the universe out there, we have data. And then the way we see that data is through various mediums. And, you know, what it boils down to is our senses. And so some things we see and some things we hear and some things we feel as heat or smell through chemicals, and they're all related. So, you know, heat influences chemistry and smell and all this stuff, and it's all like bound together. So they're, in a way, they're like taps into the same system. So what's going on here is that this is like the components you need to make, well, I'm biased on a kind of narrativity approach, but to make the system. And then there's a kind of intermediary, and then you have what I call views. And a view is anything. It can be a mouse, it could be Oculus Rift, it could be a loudspeaker. So I use view in this kind of computer science language of what, when they say view, as in model view controller, and it's very much based on that idea. But what's interesting about that is if you can create a medium like Defendex or Homunculus Nimbus or whatever, and then you could actually swap their models, and in principle, you know, they're interchangeable. I mean, it might need some tweaks, but so it creates this kind of like system where you could actually modulate something like indefinitely through that. Another thing that this is useful, which I'm going very quickly through this, but could be as a tool for analysis. So I think it could be interesting, like it's pretty challenging to categorize works that we might call media art. And I would even argue that like John's audiovisual works, you know, could be considered media art. And it's just because it's such a broad field. And, you know, the cohesion really is the technology. But one way to look at it might be to look at what is the underlying system, and then what are the outputs. And so you could compare systems based on their outputs, and then you could go back and look at them in a different way and compare their algorithms. And you might find that someone's music piece has more in common with this VR environment than it does with other music pieces. And so anyway, I haven't actually written that paper yet, but it has that potential. So there's quite a bit here, actually. You might not need to buy it or anything to learn about it. That's like half the chapter. And then when it came down to, once I finished my PhD, I was working with architects. Quasar presented this interesting problem where, and we used an off-the-shelf system, which I hacked for the first Quasar, but for the second Quasar, I actually developed this system from scratch where we have these like Arduino nodes that are networkable. And this is for Quasar. And we'd network them all together, and then and what's interesting about them, so you might know about the what are they called, the WS2812 NeoPixel kind of chip, you know, where you can talk to lots of NeoPixels. And first of all, Quasar was made before NeoPixels, or right as NeoPixels were coming out around that time. And but secondly, these not only can like make things light up or make motors move, stuff like that, but there also can be sensors. So this has a high potential to be a bidirectional sensing system. So when I was talking about the proximity sensors for Quasar 2, they were actually part of this network. So there's like feedback, and you can, you have to add power every so often, but you can actually have about 256 of these in a network. And for Quasar, we had 97. So just give you an idea, it's pretty, you know, it's half. So, but we pushed the system, you know, and we're able to draw on it at frame rate, so 30 frames per second. And so in a way, this is kind of like a hardware version of the World Maker universe framework, you know, so, but obviously more tangible. And so this is Quasar, and this is Homunculus. And the only difference is, again, it's a framework. I think of it like a framework. So it's not really a fixed system, but there's this, you know, it has components you need, like something to network, has the Arduino chip. These are all custom fabricated as well. And then for Homunculus, I got interested in the idea of like, can I make this board modular so I can, this time I'm reusing lights from Quasar, but maybe next time I want to have motors or something else. So I wanted this kind of like plug and play interface for that. I'm still undecided if this is the best kind of plug, but anyway, in the end, so that's what, that's kind of the virtual and physical manifestation of that.
I'm just curious, do you think that what you have is possible to adapt to a wireless situation? Or do you have to have the Ethernet cables?
It's so easy now, but the advantage of the wires is if you had 256, I can tell you, let's say it's Bluetooth. So Bluetooth can only handle 8 channels of wireless. If it's Zigbee, you're probably going to have a lot of interference, you know, and, you know, I mean, we're talking like 97 nodes. So I avoid wireless. I mean, I think maybe you're thinking as a performer, you might want to be wireless. So I could imagine you have several of these on a network that are connected to a single wireless access point. So you could combine the topologies. That's not a problem. And then the other thing is on that Ethernet cable, I didn't talk about that, but I'm transmitting power. So with one cable, you're getting power and signal. But you do need power drops, but it's not like having to run double cables everywhere. You just drop where you need it, and it's much cleaner. And so, yeah, wireless power still isn't available despite all the promises. But yeah, wireless is just, it's getting easier and easier. And then, these are Arduino based, but it's like for the cost of using, well, these are custom Arduino based, but for the cost of that, now you can like use Teensy or, so I started making the system work more as like a daughter board. So you could put any microcontroller on it, and, there's so many ways you could go about it. So what's important really, again, is that framework. And it's been better for me to have a framework than have some system I'm married to, because I can, as soon as I encounter a new environment, I just plug it into my framework, and I start getting to art making right away. But it's abstract. It's not always easy to communicate to others what that is. So it's spinning off of Quasar. So I mentioned Quasar in the first iteration had this muon detector in the gallery that detected cosmic rays. And when we did Quasar 2, well, it's a long story, but I was doing a lecture about Quasar 1 once in Santa Barbara, and there was a guy in the audience who said, well, I was doing all kinds of things wrong, and I still will if I talk about astrophysics, but I was pronouncing like muon incorrectly and all this stuff. And so he kind of like, his head exploded at some point, and he said, look, I was at the largest cosmic ray detector in the world and at the South Pole, and I can tell you, and he said all stuff, and I thanked him, and it was friendly, but it was also kind of hilarious because I was slaughtering the science. But anyway, that kind of stuck in my head. So when Quasar 2 came around, I said, well, what is this cosmic ray detector at the South Pole? And I found this, and I emailed them and said, can we use your data? We have this weird art project. And they agreed after a few questions because they're worried about intellectual property and stuff. And so for Quasar 2, we just played data that was recorded from this observatory, and that started this collaboration with my friend there, Jim Madsen, who's now he was in charge of education and outreach. He's now executive director of IceCube. So, and this is a collaboration with like 150 scientists worldwide, and people go to the South Pole and they winter over there because you can't leave. And this, by the way, is the observatory. It's like, if you can't see, I think it's 2 or 3 stories high. And then this detector is a cubic kilometer embedded in the ice. And that's 1,250 meters below the ice surface. So what is that in feet? Like 3,600 feet, 4,000 feet below the ice surface. And then a kilometer, hopefully you have an idea what a kilometer is, but 0.6 miles, I think. And then they have these like things called DOMs. They're about this big, that act as light sensors in the ice. And what they're trying to do is detect a lot of things. So they detect cosmic rays, but one of the big things is they're looking for something called a neutrino, which is a particle that is nearly massless. And every once in a while it interacts with other particles called hadrons and makes these blue light explosions that travel through the ice faster than it should. And that's because of the quality of the neutrino. So they know it's a neutrino explosion when they see it. And they pick it up with these light detectors, and then they analyze the data later. And so we did a couple of projects. So so I sonified their data using Super Collider. made a weird video game where neutrinos attack hadrons, and then one of the big things we were working on was these displays, and so my collaborator was, when I met him, he was making a display. He had one LED per 20 sensors, and so we made. So I said, well, I think I know, with my knowledge from Quasar and stuff, how to make this one-to-one. And so this is, just to give you an idea, there's 60 rods, 87 rods with 60 LEDs each. And that comes out to about 5,160 LEDs that we light up at frame rate. And basically what we've made here is a kind of volumetric display. So it's a one-to-one or 1 to 1,000th mapping to the cubic kilometer. So this is 2 cubic meters, or it was made in Wisconsin, so it's a cubic 8 feet. And and if you've never been to Canada, everyone's always having fun with imperial versus metric. So because it's mixed here, it's not one or the other. So, and the idea is, we display these events. And so I wanted to make like a laptop version, which came out to be a cubic meter. And so this is my version. And this is this, kind of object. I tried to make it look like furniture. So it's made out of like oak and, kind of looks like 1960s furniture. And there's a couple of interests here. So one is, there's an interest in making novel displays. So you might have noticed that there's not a lot of work I do that is, although I'm not opposed, but that is on a screen or, look through glasses. I'm really interested in our world. And this gets into this concept of aversion, which John mentioned in the bio, which is the opposite of immersion. So if immersion is putting yourself in a virtual environment, eversion is the virtual environment coming out into the real world. So it's like an aversion means turning inside out. So we're kind of turning the virtual inside out into the real with this kind of work. So there's some advantages to a volumetric display. When you're looking at data, it's squished on the 2D screen, even if it's represented in 3D. And so there's a lot of things you can miss. And a lot of this data is analyzed visually. And I think I'll go a little more than an hour, sorry. If that's okay.
Oh, it's okay, you have time.
Okay, good. And then, and so, it gives you the possibility to actually start to see the data like an object, like something really tangible. And the size and the scale of it and the way it's positioned, it's also becomes more relational to your body. And so it comes back to this kind of embodied knowing. So one of the things I'm interested in is like how this might give us an intuitive understanding of quantum mechanics, which is, it's going to be a problem. So, because in theory, we're probably all going to be working on quantum computers at some point. And so we might want to have a quantum knowledge, I guess. And I think this will happen because, somehow we've all managed to learn binary thinking and Booleans and all this stuff. So we'll probably be able to figure out square root of 3, I think. I don't know. So that's part of it. And it also gives you this kind of like intuitive understanding about something that's happening in our universe that we can't see. So a lot of these events, because they're massless, they come from the deepest depths of our space, like of outer space, like supernovas and all these cosmic events, and because of that too, they also represent kind of the edge of knowing. So Quasar, I didn't mention this, but the Quasar gets its name from these things we can see in space. They're deep in space, so that means they're deep in time. And they're these huge fiery clusters that are like millions of light years across. And they're like the biggest things we can see, and they're the most mysterious. And if you think about it, that is the horizon of knowing. because we can see it there, we know it's there, and we know it's, you know, it's like so big it's beyond imagination. So yeah, it's just what we were referring to is this like epistemological horizon. And so anyway, I had a thought there, I lost it. It's okay. So where this is kind of going, so we have this display's done, it's been exhibited a few times, and we're still working on it. I'm actually working with my research assistant, my collaborator, are working on making a general purpose audiovisual interface for it, so that it won't just display scientific data, but actually could be used in a concert or something as a kind of a weird audiovisual instrument. So it might be fun to put like theremin wires in it too, but I bet that'll happen now that I said it. Okay, so and then most recently in this project, we did this piece called Messages from the Horizon, which is inspired by this, believe it or not, pretty new approach in astrophysical research, where they try and correlate data from different observatories. So they'll see, let's say they see a supernova in space on one observatory, they'll contact the other observatories. And IceCube's considered a kind of observatory, but there's like infrared, gamma light, you know, all these kind of different kinds. And they all focus their instruments on the same event, so they can get simultaneous data in all these different perspectives. And so they call that multi-messenger research. And so this is inspired by that. So we have these persistence of vision displays, and this is actually going to be virtually on exhibit at ICEA next week. And these monitors are the taps. So one is looking at them sonically, and one of them is looking at it visually, and then one of them is actually looking at it through simulation, which is an important part of science, and to kind of like show this kind of relationship. So it's kind of like a mini universe. And then what this device is that you keep seeing is it makes these Aurora Australis clouds on the back, which is, it's like the Northern Lights, but what you see at the South Pole. So it's kind of like bringing you to the observatory again. So it's like a collapsed mini universe. And what we're going to do with this is we're going to start making, or we already started working on developing a holographic display based on persistence of vision. So we want to take these persistence of vision displays and layer them like a cake, and then rebuild this display as a holographic interface. And what this is going to allow us to do is like scale the data and rotate it. And so to look at an event, you won't have to walk around it, which we're finding is actually more inconvenient than you would think. But anyway, so you know, it's art science, but it's also about perception, knowing, experience, and beauty in a way, seeing things about the universe in new ways. And then, yeah, I just wanted to talk about one more project. You sidetracked me, so that's why I'm running over an hour. But
it's okay. You got like an hour and a half. So.
Oh, okay. Well,
yeah.
So the third project, this one might be the one that interests you most directly for your own practice, and it's because of this operational word, performance. So this is a research project that I've been doing since 2015 called Performance Art in Cyber Interceptive Systems. And so probably the only word there you're not sure about is cyber interceptive. So what this project is about is been working with these performers, Erica Bat Dwarf and Kate Digby, and this is my collaborator, Alan Macy. And I should mention, just total unimportant side story, or important but total side story, I guess. But Alan is, he's from Santa Barbara. Did you know him at all, John? Or?
No, I met him. I didn't really know him.
Yeah. So he's, well, related to this research, he's R&D director and co-founder of a company called Biopac Systems. They started in 1983, and they make sensors, bioinformatics sensors, and analysis systems. So it's a lot of signal processing, actually. But you'd be surprised how much music knowledge, computer music knowledge, comes in handy in doing something like biosensing. And and you know, he's also an artist, and he's one prominent member of a place called Fishbone in Santa Barbara, which is currently, this is the side story, the permanent host for Defendex. So if you're ever in Santa Barbara and you want to see Defendex, you just have to go to Fishbone, if you can find it, and turn it on, and it's actually still working. So amazing, yeah. And so it was donated to them. It was either donated to them or throw it in the bin. So it was good that we did the latter. Anyway, so this is, getting back to the subject here, Kate and Erica have been involved for many years, like 20 years or more, with this technique that Erica developed called the Bat Dwarf Technique, which is a performance technique that involves, I'll just put it in layman's terms, like maybe you've heard of method acting, you know, so this is something deeper. So method acting, like you've heard of infamously probably about method actors who embody a character and they won't leave the character and all this stuff. And this is kind of very much based on kind of like Freudian kind of view of psychology, but their performance practice is based more on a somatic technique, and it's pretty commonplace nowadays, so I don't want to make it sound too novel, except there are aspects about her technique that are novel, but the idea is that you're using things like yoga and meditation and movement practices, and combining them with performance in order to have a deeper connection with the systems of the body. And their system gets into like physiology in a deep way. So the way I got involved with working with Erica was, this is always makes academics laugh, but we were on a curriculum committee together, and she started asking me questions, and she said, well, by the way, I have this project I'm doing that's going to premiere at the Venice Biennale. Would you like to be involved with that? And I was like, sure. And if you don't know, that's like one of the biggest art fairs in the world. So it was like a real privilege to be there. And we did this work called Burnish, which was a solo work where she's in this tent. I designed the tent. The tent, if you see it from an aerial view, it makes a little more sense, but it's kind of based on the chambers of a heart. And it's, I 3D fabricated all the joints and made it with tent poles. And then we had someone build the cover, and then there's this like window, and actually you did this piece, John, right? So
yes, I did. Yes.
Yeah, and you sit at the window, and it's a piece for one person. She does this kind of reading, and based on the reading, it's actually an interactive story because she has these buttons inside, and as she does the reading, she's triggering these buttons, and these determine like what song is played, how long the dance lasts, and she makes a gift that's just for you. So it's a performance really for one person, and it's a lot about, you know, releasing trauma and facing your fear and things like that. And as we're working, and as a natural thing you might do with a collaborator, I wanted to know about her techniques and methodology and worldview. And as she was talking about this, and so one of the things they do with the physiology is they recreate emotive states. So they don't, unlike method acting, they don't try and be angry, but they actually try and change their physiology in the same way as if you were angry. So meaning that psychologically they're not angry, but physiologically their body is, meaning their heart rate is elevated, it's very regular, their skin temperature rises, they're actually able to, because they've been doing these like deep somatic practices able to tap into these systems. They can feel their heart on command. They can feel their digestion. They can feel, you know, their nervous system. And so they're deeply virtuosic performers. So one way to look at this project is making interactive interfaces for virtuosic performers, which is a lot different than making an iPhone app or something, which is, you know, for the non-virtuosic, you know, performer, if you think about it. But then what we're doing, and this gets into kind of my perspectives on interactivity and a bit, which is really I've always been looking for something deeper in interactivity than just kind of the novelty of, and not that I dismiss, you know, a good game controller or something, because it's, you know, the right tool for the job, but in terms of an experience of an artwork, I'm always looking for something deeper. And when I start to realize is that deeper thing is human connectivity. So finding ways that people connect to each other, people connect to systems in ways that are meaningful. And again, coming back to this like embodied knowing through the senses, and exposing these kind of like, as Alan would put it, like non-volitional systems to each other. And so we have like this simple piece, this is something Alan designed, which is called the Heart in Hand. It's not active right now, there's a picture of it. And it, you can hook yourself up with electrodes. You can't see, but I have an entire bio lab right here. So you have these electrodes you hook up, you know, which you might have, if you've ever done a physical, it's something they use. And you hook up your heart, and you can grab your heart rate, and then from your heart, you can assess things like how excited you are by how fast your heart is beating, and then how regular your heart is. So the more regular your heart is, the more stressed you are. So like if you're in, an extreme example is like if you're in like fight or flight mode, then your heart starts pounding. And what's going on there is your brain is, I think I'm rambling a little bit, that's okay. Your brain kind of disconnects from your body when you're in a more meditative state. And when that happens, oh, sorry, I was saying it in the reverse. When you're getting in this fight or flight mode, your brain just kind of takes over the systems of your body and starts, you know, everything starts working like a clock, which is very useful if you might need to like suddenly leap, you know, into the river or whatever you need to do to get away from the bear. And, but, you know, if you're in a more calm, serene situation, your brain kind of disengages, and you know that's happening because you start daydreaming, fantasizing, all these kinds of things. And what happens with your organs, they can self-regulate just fine. So they just kind of do their own thing, and they start to drift. So your heart rate gets really irregular, but not in a eurythmic way, but in a, you know, I don't mean you have arrhythmias, but I mean like it, you know, but the spacing between the beats kind of is more relaxed. And so we can say when you have that heart rate variability, that you're in a kind of more serene state. And so if you have a high arousal and you're serene, that's kind of more like joy. And if you're at a low arousal and your heart rate's more regular, that's like depression or sadness. And so so we can kind of use that to assess a motive state. So that's one of the things we can do. And we can grab breathing from heart rate, you know, and all this is through, you know, elaborate signal processing, basically. And so I wouldn't say we've cracked the egg, but we've been doing a number of projects where we explore how we can use this, the biophysiology as an interactive interface. And then if you have someone who knows how, this comes back to the performers, who actually knows how to control this internal biophysiology, then all of a sudden you have someone who can, it's very useful for the research, but it's also interesting in terms of performance, because they can actually start to control these systems that are otherwise out of our awareness even. So
that's really interesting, and how that relates to meditation, where you have this idea of separating out those physiological responses from your mind. And that way of knowing is kind of interesting from your perspective, to think about that it is an experiential thing that you have to separate from to know.
Yeah. So maybe I'll end on this thought. So, and it's a thought that probably will generate probably more conversation, I hope. But I'm sure you can imagine as COVID started, it was pretty disruptive to the lab. And I have a regular lab meeting with about this size of group of lab members. And we were pretty consistent about meeting the entire summer. And I even like held a class that they attended that was like without credit. And no one knew I was doing it except me and them. And all this stuff. And so through our conversation, I kind of came up with 3 questions that we're using to kind of explore this time. So one way to look at something like COVID or any kind of disruption is it can be a hindrance. It's difficult, and don't want to undermine, the loss of life or anything, but it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity to kind of like look at what you're doing differently and how the world can and will be different. And by anticipating that, we can also help shape how the world will be different. So, if you don't ask, then you don't decide, someone decides for you. So anyway, I asked kind of 3 questions. So one was, what is meaningful? The other one is, why are you here? And the third one is, why be normal? And so in terms of what is meaningful, I think, the one thing we came up with was human connectivity. And so what we've been exploring is like new ways to use like this kind of medium to connect with people in different ways. So we're trying to explore how to kind of like punk the medium, hack it, or come up with new approaches. So like one thing we did was we started playing a game where we would call it Exquisite Corpse, where we would send each other a chunk of a recording in a succession. And this was done on the internet, although we had talked about doing it by mail. And basically we don't listen to any of the other recordings, we just add our own. And then we started introducing rules where you could listen to a little bit of the recording and all this stuff to make it more elaborate. But then in the end, we'd listen to it and we'd have this kind of like composition. What was interesting about that is it gives you this kind of like linkage, that's beyond the meeting. And, you kind of look forward to this thing. And you don't get much, you just get a little email. Here's my contribution, it's your turn, and here's who's next. And we had a random number generator to determine who's next. And that was interesting. I mean, eventually it kind of fizzled out, but now we're starting to think of interactive systems that are inspired by that. And I don't want to elaborate too much, but maybe I'll tell John to let you guys know when we do that performance. We're building a performance around that idea. So, and then why are you here? And this comes back to this idea of world making. So I kind of hinted at that. So it's like, I think with art, we can ask questions that are purely speculative. So it's unlike any other area of research. And because of that, we can not only speculate, but anticipate the future. But when I'm talking about the future, I'm talking about something pretty far off. Like there's already people, they've already made up their minds what life's going to be like after COVID. And it's probably going to be a surprise to a lot of us, but I'm pretty sure that certain aspects of our work life and things like that will change dramatically, and only because of opportunity. And so we need to take this opportunity to make different kinds of opportunity that afford the kind of connections to work and life that we want. And then the other thing is the production of knowledge, but knowledge as an aesthetic knowledge, and finding new ways to associate and connect with each other. And then the question that sort of relates to the question of why be normal. And that was a response, especially in the early COVID outbreak time, there's a lot of question of the new, or a lot of discussion of the new normal. And I always feel a little bit worried when people start talking about normality anyway, because it's a slippery slope, and I probably my punk rock roots or whatever. But so I was wondering, you know, what is the new abnormal, or what is the new weird? And I was also arguing that maybe normal is the problem, because, you know, normal means systemic racism and laissez-faire capitalism, perpetual war, corruption. So maybe what we want is abnormal. And and I would also argue that what they're describing as the new normal is not new. So like work at home, like, I don't know if you know, like companies like Google are taking full advantage. So Google's decided they're going to have their students, thinking like a teacher, their employees work from home indefinitely. And I'm also wondering about the impacts on education. So, you know, clearly technology can help education, but it can also be a hindrance and could lead to more commodification of knowledge and the loss of, you know, the liberal arts university and all these things. So I think, you know, it's good to question. So anyway, yeah, I think I'll leave it there. So
Well, that's a great place to stop, because that raises a lot of questions. That's very good. So I want to open it up to some of the people here in this meeting. If you have any comments or questions, now would be a good time to speak up.
I didn't think that was going to get as deep as it did. That was cool. Like, there was so much stuff that I just really have never even conceptualized that you talked about, and I don't know. I don't have a whole lot to say, honestly.
Oh no, thank you for that. Appreciate that. How do I get funding for projects? That's a good question. So it's not easy. So I'll give you a couple examples, I guess. So with Homunculus Nimbus, I saw this call for a rock festival in town, and they were looking for artworks. So I thought, well, I'll just propose to make a pavilion. And the pavilion, it might look expensive, but I made it for about $5,000 or $6,000. And I could have made it cheaper, but I screwed up something when I was making it. So, which cost me $1,500. And in part because I was reusing pieces from the previous exhibition. But so they gave me $2,500. And so then I just threw in some money I get through like I can get small grants through my university and stuff. And then once I had the piece on the ground, then I could shop it around. So there was a call that just came right after, and they said they were looking for light-based artworks to show on the lakeshore. This is Canada, Toronto, over the winter. So I proposed this piece, and I knew it would get kind of destroyed, which it did, because there's like wind and ice and all kinds of crazy stuff going on. And I had to waterproof all the electronics, but you know, that was successful. And I actually made $500 on that project. So that was a first, you know. But like with Pachis, like, so we got a small grant to do a workshop, but a lot of it's just like kind of as we go. So we get a little bit of Arts Council funding. Sometimes you get money from a private organization, but well, I'm an academic, so let me put it this way. So maybe you don't want to be an academic. So if you're not going to be an academic, don't have my business strategy. But because I'm an academic, my art is my research, and I'm able to be very speculative with it. And so it allows me to not make money. But I've kind of got tired of spending money on art on my projects, so I try and break even, at least. And that's a pretty good goal. Otherwise, it's kind of like, and it depends. You know, if it's a new work, I look at it kind of like an venture investment, you know, and I'm hoping that I'll show it more than once. And then when I show it again, I once I collect a few fees, I might break even. But like Homunculus Nimbus went so well, I was able to hire students to help me, like, pay them like union wages to install and deinstall the work, and so that's good. So it's tricky. And then with performance, as soon as you start working performance professionally, like we're working with a lot of performers who aren't academics, so you have to pay them a living wage, because if you don't pay them properly, they'll have to take a different job. It's just the way it goes. And they have children, and they, all the worries everyone else does. So, so anyway, it's a tricky question, but, and the other thing I'd say about is I have a friend, or he's more of an acquaintance, but a friend or more than acquaintance, but not a friend, I don't know, kind of in between state, but I don't keep in touch with. But I asked him, because he's a pretty successful artist, how that works. And he says, well, the thing is, it's a bit of chicken and the egg. So once you start making things that are ambitious, then people start believing that you can make them, and then they start hiring you to do them, so that's a bit of that investment too. And it's probably true for anybody, whether you're going to be academic or professional, that it's going to take some investment, before you're going to get that recognition and start getting, whether you open a recording studio or anything, start getting that reputation, and then it starts feeding on itself. Hopefully that helps. But like I say, I've come from a place of privilege, so I'm not the starving artist. I get paid to be a professor, not to be an artist, but I use that to do weird stuff. So, yeah. Any other thoughts, questions, or suggestions?
If we wanted to if we research your projects more and we wanted to know more about them, can we email you? Is that okay? Like, to ask you questions like, why did you pick this over this? Why did you?
Yeah, of course. I only charge $5 Canadian for. No, I was kidding.
Oh, so that's like 5 cents.
Please email me, and in fact, I'll make it easy on you.
I guess I have maybe a closing question, and because we're starting to look at some work here where we're going to scrape data from Twitter or something of the sort, and I'm glad that you talked about what you talked about today, because it kind of justifies that that in this model that you have proposed, there is data, right? And it's almost irrelevant in a sense what that data is, maybe. But do you think that's true, what I just said? Is it irrelevant what the data is? Does it matter? Is there pattern in everything? Does it matter if there's pattern?
Well, I don't know if I can answer the last two questions, but I don't think it's irrelevant what the data is, but it's more that that it could be treated modularly. I mean, there's something more to that. I mean, this is a little bit in my writing, but which deals with knowing as well, which is that I argue that to make something or one approach, I guess, like if you want to make something that feels deep, is that the data could be deeper than what someone sees. And I'd argue they would sense that. And so the metaphor I've used, I don't know if it's a good metaphor, but it's like like a lake that you throw a stone into. So you can't really see what's happening when the stone goes in the water, but you could imagine that it's interacting with this whole world that's more or less invisible to you because of the way the sun's hitting the water or whatever. And so there's something underneath the surface, and that'll become apparent because things will emerge that that maybe you don't expect, or there's something, so it adds, so there's a universe in there. So that's where that concept comes from. And then the data itself, of course, it's relevant, right? And that's what's going to give you, I mean, the medium it's still a medium, even though the medium is a message. It's still it's a filter for the content. you know, so the content matters.
Yeah. Okay, I think with that, I'm going to stop recording the meeting and stop being on Facebook. So I'll say goodbye to Facebook here.